Pleasure to introduce Dr. Monica Ramirez-Andreotta. Dr. Ramirez-Andreotta is an assistant professor of environmental science at the University of Arizona. Using an environmental justice framework and participatory research methods, she investigates exposure pathways and communication strategies to translate environmental health research to action and achieve structural change. As demonstrated by our flagship company, created community citizen science programs titled Garden Roots and Project Harvest. She applies the empowerment education model, strives to elucidate and eradicate environmental health risks, and co-designs public health prevention, intervention programs, and communication strategies to engage, build efficacy, and address structural challenges in underserved and affected populations. To do this, she integrates pollution and exposure science, sociology, art, and environmental health communication. So today it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Ramirez-Andreotta to our ENST seminar.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you, Candace, for that introduction. You were missed, and thank you for this invitation. So today I'll be giving an overview presentation called Participatory Research Methods for Environmental Action. So to begin this talk, I'd like to acknowledge the lands in which the University of Arizona resides. And so we are on the lands of indigenous peoples. Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson. Oh, just heads up, I'm going to be admitting people, I guess, or is there another host on to admit people as they join? I think I'm a co-host, so somebody else would help with that. Okay.
I got it.
Thank you so much. All right, just double checking. Okay. And so Tucson, Arizona is home to, Tucson is home to the Tono O'odham and Yaqui. And also the University of Arizona is a Hispanic serving institution. So in 2019, the U of A was among the 9 higher education institutions to receive a seal of excelencia for Latino leadership success in data, practice, and leadership. We also recently, within our department, Dr. Carletta Chief is now the director of a center, a resilience center, to continue to partner and work with indigenous communities across the state. As I've been doing this entire year is dedicating this presentations or any presentation I give to Roy C. Chavez. Roy C. Chavez was a community activist and community champion in the town of Superior, Arizona, and truly taught me how to challenge the business as usual model. And so unfortunately they died due to COVID-19. And just this past weekend, I was at their funeral. They were finally able to have a gathering and funeral. So who am I? So in the introduction, thank you so much, Candace, provided is looking at like, what do I do, right? So as a scientist, ready to have environmental science skills, sociology skills, public health skills, but also I am an artist and have an art degree and very much rely on and pull from the visual communications and arts to do the work I'm doing today. I'm also a second generation Mexican-American or Chicana. So I was born within the US or Arizona-Mexico border region, right? We have the La Paz Agreement of 1983 to serve and protect this area from environmental degradation. And it is that during my experiences growing up and bearing witness to environmental and social degradation in these areas and beyond that have prompted me to do the type of justice work and dedication to underserved communities as I have today. And so just highlighting who I am as a person and giving you my positionality statement as a researcher that I've bared witness and am dedicated to the Southwest and communities that are experiencing injustices. And so the core goal of my lab and students is to achieve environmental health and climate justice for all. Just a heads up, this is my Nana in the upper right corner of this image who held my dad in so that he could be a US citizen and for the opportunities for our future generations. This is no new news, right? Pollution is now the leading global cause of premature death and disease. So the Lancet report has been demonstrating this for quite some, or a large, seminal paper came out demonstrating that pollution disproportionately kills the poor and the vulnerable, and that it's the leading cause of premature death and disease. So we are in the right field to create the change we want to see. This is a map of all federally designated cleanup sites. You can see that environmental contamination is prevalent. According to the US General Accounting Office, 1 in 4 Americans live within 3 miles of a hazardous waste site. So meaning that your zip code is more important than your genetic code. So it is this statistic and this notion that fuels the work of myself, my lab, and my students, and recognizing that this is unjust. Because we know that if we achieve environmental justice, environmental health disparities would be reduced. And when we talk about disparities, we're talking about the differences in health outcomes that are closely linked with social, economic, and environmental disadvantage. We also need to recognize that these are unnecessary, avoidable, and unfair and unjust. So in thinking about an environmental justice framework, and to note and document that environmental justice frameworks have been critiqued. So there's a critical environmental justice framework, and people have been, but in this notion of looking at environmental justice, it was developed to uncover the underlying assumptions that contribute to and produce unequal protection. So this requires us as researchers and practitioners and stakeholders to ask the political and ethical questions about who gets what, why, and how much. But it also requires problems of social and economic it also creates problems of social and economic complexity, which requires new forms of investigation. Because there are critical and fundamental challenges that exist in environmental justice communities. One is the limits of epidemiology and the public health context. There is scientific uncertainty, and epidemiology alone cannot adequately detect the effects of toxic exposures. Sometimes crude and simplistic analyses can be used to shut down health concerns. And we have to, no matter what, account for the interrelated effects of culturally diverse and economically disadvantaged groups with toxic exposure. We also need to acknowledge that there are forms of technical elitism. There's expert control over community concern and observation. And so this is where you'll see later as why I'm advocating for a participatory approach to triumph over this expert control. But at the same time, we recognize that we need to raise scientific literacy to combat expert biases that might be occurring in these spaces. So if we look at really what, the environmental justice challenges, I'm going to read this from a recent paper, right? Conventional health intervention and health promotion strategies have largely failed to mitigate the sources of environmental health risk for environmental justice communities because the strategies often address health at the individual behavior level rather than interacting with relevant social, cultural, and political contexts. So I say this because what happens traditionally is that the burden of proof and the burden and responsibility to reduce risk is placed on the individual and the community. And this is not going to solve the complex challenges associated with injustice, environmental injustice, and environmental racism. That we have to be looking and asking questions and dealing and interacting with the relevant social and cultural and political context. So yes, as scientists, physical, earth, chemical, I'm asking all of us to engage at the social, cultural, and political level. One way to do that is looking at citizen and community science. One way to engage, further engage. This is where very generally has been defined as involving the public in data collection and analysis, which can support science and public engagement. However, this term, there's other terms for, there's citizen science, but then there's like a whole field and different researchers from different disciplines have been putting forth participatory efforts and ways in which to address and create structural change. So here's just a list of all the different terms that you might have seen, or maybe there's some new terms here, but acknowledging, right, you're seeing partnership come up, community owned and managed research, right? That is actually from one of University of Maryland College Park's very own, Jacoby Wilson's work. You see community-driven research, CBPR, listed twice here, just to emphasize it with great intensity. I'm just kidding, that's a typo. All right, moving right along. So environmental justice projects are motivated to prompt structural change. So what is structural change, right? Here we're defining structural change as the macro or meso level determinants of health. So this is like getting to the structural and the root of something. So looking at zoning, economic policy, political power, the built environment, environmental policy enforcement. And so with this, we posit that academic institutions can leverage their positions of power through collaboration with environmental justice communities in ways that work upstream to structurally address the systems that perpetuate injustice. And so for today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to outline from two co-created citizen science programs or community science programs, Garden Roots and Project Harvest, the role in which the community played in the different steps of the scientific research process, as you see here listed in yellow. All right, so Candace lived in AZ for a little bit, right? Happy to have Candace in the hometown. But imagine you live near resource extraction, right? So these are images of what it looks, some of the mining and what it looks like. You got some bird eye views, you got some kind of worm's eye views here. However, I want to acknowledge, right, that you have fugitive dust emissions moving off of mine tailings piles with high levels, potentially high levels of metals with a low pH. And so during, we're in a semi-arid and arid environment in Arizona. So we get the fugitive dust and atmospheric deposition potentially of these contaminants in residential areas. We also have water erosion. When we do get rain, you can see that in this top image of how the water will assimilate with the chemicals and elements in that material and move it along down into communities. You can actually see here in this bird's eye view, there was a 1964 blowout on a tailings pile, which moved a tremendous amount of mine tailings waste across the highway and into a residential area. Here you can see we have one of the largest freestanding objects in Arizona for sure, a copper smelter in Hayden, Winkelmann. And so the communities for Garden Roots were located in Yavapai, Apache, Pinal, and Cochise. And for the sake of, to contextualize the motivation of these participants, we did a community needs assessment and ongoing community engagement. And you can see that those counties that were involved also are co-located with mining activities. Here's another map looking at the different resource extraction activities. This is where Project Harvest communities, so these are where community members were asking questions about the quality of their harvested rainwater, which I'll get into. But what I'm doing here is just showing you the layers, right? So here's the county and mining, major mining products. Here's all types of mines, community engagement at the county level. Here's taking that federally designated cleanup sites, showing you communities in which are engaging. This is a map of toxic release inventory data for the state, showing about that we have about 264 toxic release inventory sites in Arizona. Boom, layering over the communities that of interest. And if we start looking again at taking this bird's eye view of the communities and specifically to Project Harvest, you can see what I have listed here is the year in which I began partnership and trust building with these communities and the number of participants engaged in these spaces. And so one thing to notice is in some of these spaces I've been engaging for over a decade. And so true partnership building and relations are critical in this work. Here we can see, looking at, apologies for the graphical error here, that's frustrating. Here we can see that taking that first step in scientific research is choosing and defining that question for study. I'd like to acknowledge here that questions are derived from community needs assessments, listening, right, at community advisory boards, listening to non-governmental organizations in the area, and then just ongoing interactions with local community members. So Garden Roots really revolves around, are my soils safe? Is it safe for me to consume vegetables from my garden? And if so, how much? But also takes on different forms depending on community concerns. So in the Superior, Arizona area, they were very much concerned about air quality. And if there are uncontrolled sources of dust in the community that could lead to exposure to contaminants of concern. And then a project in rural California is looking at if the ingestion of soil and plants grown in local gardens are contributing to arsenic and cadmium exposure. And this is coming from a community-based organization and a community-based community advisory board looking at if the arsenic and cadmium exposure due to so this area I should say is at the base of the Sierra Nevadas, an area that was highly, gold mining in the area. And so there are concerns about the legacy gold mines in that area. And concomitantly, this area has, or this county, the counties in this area have the second highest breast cancer rate in the state of California. And so this has led for community members and breast cancer survivors to be asking questions about whether the environment is leading to exposures to arsenic and cadmium, and looking at ways to mitigate children's exposure. If we look at Project Harvest, we know that people are trying to do the right thing. They are harvesting rainwater to reduce their water footprint and dependency on the groundwater in the area. But they're aware of where they live, and they want to know how they can use that water. And so they're asking questions about, are there pollutants in the harvested rainwater? If so, if they use it in their garden, could it impact the soils and the plants? So one of the ways that Project Harvest really came about is working with a community-based organization called the Sonoran Environmental Research Institute, and working with promotoras, or local-based community health workers. And so here in 2016, the nonprofit organization and I led a community change and environmental sustainability training for promotoras. Here you can see that 20 promotoras completed the training, conducted 50 home visits to discuss climate change and resiliency with community members. I would say that we targeted the southern metropolitan Tucson area, which has closer proximity to toxic release inventory sites and is considered the environmental justice communities. But together, they also collected soil and harvested rainwater samples. And this was a good test bed to see how it worked to use the empowerment education model with promotoras to engage communities in this area. This is building off of years worth of partnership and work in the space. And just to highlight that my mom was one of the promotoras for this training, and it was hilarious to have them in the training. So again, looking at, we can conserve water and reduce our heat island effect through rainwater harvesting. So this is thinking about a free water source to increase the level of tree and tree canopy in the area. Engagement across communities can vary across forms, right? So here you can see for the town of Dewey, Humboldt, predominantly white community. However, it's rural, living near a legacy mine tailing Superfund site. Here we can see that a father and community champion raised the question for study along with other community members. And in a 2008 meeting, I was sitting in there listening, and that actually led to my dissertation project with the engaging this community. We can see here that this individual was provided residential soils for a controlled greenhouse study. And this mother here started an NGO to get a technical assistance grant, and was a co-author of a paper and current member of an advisory board. So community engagement is critical in this type of work. Here we're looking at engagement and partnership fostered by the superintendent. So this is Hayden Winkelmann, an environmental justice community, predominantly Latino, Latinx. And we can see here that the level of engagement and communication was fostered through the superintendent. So the superintendent was very supportive of any work that would increase informal science education opportunities for their students in the community. Here's another example of how these partnerships come about, looking at engaging a coalition. So this is Superior, Arizona, a community predominantly, if you do the EJ screening mapping tool on this community, they're in the 90th, or I think around the 96th percentile in proximity to a wastewater discharge facilities. And this is, again, predominantly Hispanic or Latino community, mining community, looking at continuing community environmental education, and looking to protect current and future families moving into the area. So in all of these spaces, we did some type of co-created environmental science monitoring and community science work. Here's another space, a little bit different. This is Globe Miami. So Miami, what you see highlighted here is predominantly Latino, Latinx, and then we have a little mixed population of the Globe area, but you can see where Miami resides next to these mine tailing piles, and there's the active Freeport-McMoRan mine. And so for starting partnerships and engagement in this area in 2015, 2016, started with working with an extension agent and a museum director. However, they were interested in the work and wanted to do some environmental monitoring, specifically around the harvested rainwater to understand the quality. However, I had to meet with the mine to get their blessing. So they set up a meeting with Freeport-McMoRan, and I gave as people say, the dog and pony show, and got their blessing to be able to work there. However, all the community meetings and trainings were at the museum, and that museum is the Bullion Plaza, is the renovated Bullion Plaza School, which served as a segregated school for Mexican-American children until 1952. So just again, touching base back to my positionality as a Chicana, hosting community trainings with an environmental justice community in a formerly segregated Mexican-American school was definitely uncomfortable, but it's critical to understand the histories of the areas in which you're working. All right, so another thing to consider here is looking at, the next step in research, gathering information and resources. Okay, so this is where it's really important to listen, meet people where they are, recognize them as local experts in their own right, and have these informal and education gatherings to identify interested community members and areas of interest. And so in this case, Roy and I organized a series of environmental health talks around soil, air, and water quality. And we offered these throughout the community. And it was through these talks that it became very clear that they wanted to do garden roots and some type of environmental monitoring. So the efforts in this area focused on dust, settled dust, and air quality. With Project Harvest, we have promotoras, right? And so these are the 7 different promotoras in each of the communities. If we look at the participants, right, so who's engaging in these projects. So for an example, I'll show Project Harvest and their intersectionalities. So over 50% are low income, do not have a college degree, and identified as a person of color. 25% speak Spanish as their dominant language, and almost 50% were from those rural communities. So in Project Harvest, we had a mixture of the rural mining towns as well as Tucson, Arizona, with the majority of participants coming from the southern metropolitan area or the environmental justice region of the Tucson. When we think about how to increase diverse participation in these type of citizen science programs, we saw that after doing a mixed method, so using social science here, that when we talk to people about their motivation, right, they were more likely to be motivated by existing relationships with individuals or organizations, or by the fact that the research was going to address a perceived risk. So the research was clearly connected to an identified community issue, right? This is not going in and imposing. This is where you're listening and they're bringing that research question to light, and you're co-designing the project together. The other thing I'd like to highlight is that traditionally in citizen science projects, the participants are white, highly educated, and affluent. Here we see that, and that when you ask those type of individuals why they're a part of the community science, their citizen science program, they'll say that they want to learn for the sake of learning or contributing to science. What we say here is that individuals of non-traditional participants, as defined here on this slide, are less likely to be motivated by that. So don't assume participant motivation to contribute to science research or to increase personal knowledge is going to be the motivation of the participant in the community. It is really that you're connecting to their identified issues. Your liaisons, like having promotores or working with community champions, right? And you're connecting and you're building on existing personal and organizational relationships, which is why I spent so much time talking about the engagement and building trust in these spaces. Support, one of the things that came across very clearly with Project Harvest is that more likely to be supported by personal interactions than written materials. So you might spend a lot of time writing up these like fact sheets and all this goodie. In the end, people said that like when we like, I call my promotora, I call you, Monica, and I come to events that you host so that I can engage and ask questions. And so we spent a lot of time with data sharing, which ended up being a very important supporting mechanism of the project, of both Garden Roots and Project Harvest. Barriers, so just as thinking in terms of engagement, we worked in rural areas. So one of the I think the highest, if you look at internet access by county across the state, the highest is 37% of people having internet access. And so you can't rely on that. You have to provide alternatives to digital media. And recognize that lack of time was the most frequently reported barrier. And so build in flexibility into your programs and have a tiered participation structure that allows for people to engage based on their own availability. All right, so like moving into like now the steps in designing and collecting samples. And so in both Project Harvest and Garden Roots, people decide where to collect the soil samples, what vegetables to grow and submit for analysis based on their own consumption patterns. They're collecting samples and recording data. And in Project Harvest, we had half the participants do a do-it-yourself methodology where they're getting their results like within an hour or a week, depending on the method. and they're sending that out to us and sharing with us. Do culturally informed exposure assessments. This would require dietary assessments, understanding the cultural idiosyncrasies and how that might impact diet, how that could impact gardening behavior and practices, right? And modifying the exposure assessment to the communities in which you're working with. And now we get into the next steps of interpreting data, dissemination, and asking new questions. And so, as I stated previously, a lot of time is spent on data sharing and community gatherings. And when you're doing this type of work, participants want to see what you see here listed, right? When they're looking at their environmental results, typically participants have questions regarding a description. So what did you find? What were you looking for? How much, right? The concentration, and a point of analysis or comparison, or some type of contextualization of the data. So is that value high? Is that value safe? Where did the chemical come from? What should I focus on? Where should I put my efforts? And and lastly, and most importantly, what should I do? So providing in that moment, right? So that you're bracketing all of this, where you have this ongoing experience and learning. You're sharing all the data. They're the owners of that data set. You're using a community first reporting model, which I can talk about later, right? They have their information, and you're bracketing that with the intervention, right? So what you can do now that you have this data set, if you need to do anything. Some ways to think about these types of engagements and communication strategies are listed here. So you can build in experiential, hands-on, visual, community online engagement, even though in some cases the online won't be viewed as much depending on your population. But I'm just highlighting here what we did across Project Harvest and Garden Roots. So you can see we have online interfaces and field work, tremendous amount of information and presentations, swag, multiple and ongoing community gatherings, and an art installation. And so just to give you a flavor of some of the data sharing, right, is at one community, because they were a Superfund site, it was very critical to unveil the risk assessment process used to inform decision and cleanup levels in that community. And so a lot of the communication revolved around the exposure assessment, and the community wanted to know how much they could eat from their garden. So we looked at how much you could eat from your garden at different target risks. This is looking at garden, like another visualization of the participants' levels in green. Everyone else in the community is this like yellowy or tan color, and then the maximum contaminant levels are represented in red. Here's looking at Garden Roots in 2018 to 2019 of reporting back soil data, concentrations in garden vegetables, and then really giving parents this estimated exposure to the different contaminants that we measured from the different environmental media, so that a parent could quickly see the percent contribution of each of the measured media by chemical, or in this case, by metalloid. So here they can see that for arsenic, if they had a child between 2 and less than 3 years old, that reducing their consumption from lettuce, which is an Asteraceae plant from the Asteraceae family, would significantly reduce their exposure as compared to 3 and less than 6, where it was kale. Cadmium was predominantly from, you see here, the carrot. So, and then lead was predominantly from soils. And so again, this is a merging of that culturally relevant exposure assessment, doing a dietary and food frequency questionnaire combined with the gardening survey to inform and create a tool that families could use right away. Now, just because I know you might be excited to look at some of the rainwater data, this is just a snippet of looking at mean concentrations by community of different pesticide and industrial compounds in the rainwater. These are in nanograms per liter. So the number above each bar indicates the number of detections out of a total of 595 roof harvested rainwater samples. And what I'd like to acknowledge here is that we see pentachlorophenol, right? And we see that the Globe Miami had one of the higher concentrations. This is something that's widely used to treat utility poles and railroads. Looking at Prometon as an herbicide, right? We saw and detected this across communities. And interestingly, right, when you go into this space of there's greater mean concentration of industrial compounds. However, that's kind of the order of concentration, but I'm just showing you, like, right, we've got some perfluorinated compounds in the rainwater. Interesting, like PFOA, a little bit of a higher mean concentration in the Tucson area with the highest number of detections, but PFAS was not significantly different across communities. Anyways, we could like spend hours on this, moving right along. But looking at arsenic and rainwater, we can see here we had some background water, which we called Luke Sky water here. This would be water that directly was collected into a wet deposition sampler versus the others, which are harvested rainwater hitting a roof, going into a gutter and a cistern system. We can see here, these are all 3 years worth of data. And ultimately, we see all communities have a significant greater value of arsenic than the background or sky water data, and that Hayden Winkelmann was significantly greater or than the other communities. Lead, we did not see significant differences too much across. We saw it initially, but in the post hoc test, it was not significant anymore, but just looking at the trends in lead. Just again, kind of looking at when we look at these concentrations of arsenic and lead in rainwater, we are seeing, like in the Globe Miami area, the further away you are from the mine boundary, the lower the concentration of arsenic and lead. So significantly lower concentrations further away from the mine. And specifically in Hayden Winkelmann, if we look at the arsenic concentration, let me go into this slide really quick. There was a strike. So we had this experiment of looking at how the strike might impact the rainwater samples. And so arsenic is lower in the town of Winkelmann once the smelter is shut down. So now I'm going to, I sprinkled in some data slides for you going back to this process of participatory approaches to achieve environmental justice. One of the things, like I keep highlighting, is data sharing practices. And so with Project Harvest, we did formative evaluation to inform all the data sharing practices. And here was where I brought up having an art background. I was very interested in looking at the communication intervention and to looking at how novel data visualizations alone, like in a booklet only, would compare to an art experience and a booklet. And so this is where the hypothesis would be that the art experience would lead to longer lasting changes in the participant and the community because of its being more memorable. And so we're collecting this type of data right now and writing about it. However, we did measure data interpretation, sentiment, intention, memory, recall, and action, and if whether these 5 items were different based on the type of data sharing event they attended. To give you one of the things going back to the formative evaluation of the data sharing materials, it was very important to engage, understand how people were currently using their harvested rainwater and use that to guide and contextualize the data sharing experience. And so we chose different standards and advisories based on how people were currently using the water, based on promotora recommendations and preferences and the availability. And so here you can see that participants were prompted, how do you use your rainwater, how do you use your water? And then we tell them, look at the corresponding standard on the graph to see if your rainwater sample is below or above the value represented by a colored line. And so here you can see the different standards we were able to identify. And here's the final resolution or visualization that was used in the participants booklet and on an interactive online web tool. So the participant sample is highlighted in a color. The rest of the community is highlighted in gray. They're able to compare their rainwater sample to the field blank they also collected. And then all the different regulatory or reference values are shown with a horizontal colored line. I won't go into too much of this, but I had an art student who recently graduated, and they had a project called Ripple Effect. And this is where we converted the concentration data into sound. And so literally had a speaker on top, a tray of water on top of a speaker with an LED. And so this would, it would vibrate at the concentration, create ripples in the water as seen here. And if it exceeded a standard, the light would go off. And so this was the art intervention used. And actually we recently got a paper published, and this work will be exhibited in a national gallery in Rome next year. Presentations, and like I said, it's very important to provide solutions and strategies to prevent exposure, prevent and reduce exposures. So here you can see providing families with bilingual tools of how to prepare the garden, and really taking each of those standards showing the value. And here it says, this is in Spanish, right? But if your rainwater is above this standard, what does that mean? And this is where you're very clearly getting your direction of what intervention needs to be taken if you are above that standard. All of this is understanding community experience comes from this mixed methods approach to learning, a mixture of written surveys, interviews, and focus groups. I'm just highlighting, again, the transdisciplinary nature of my work and efforts. And with this type of evaluation, we can document what people are doing. And so we have been clearly able to document individual action. And we have seen that participants using the environmental health literacy theoretical framework, we are seeing increases in scientific and environmental literacy and numeracy. We actually administered a survey because we had to cancel our monsoon sampling because of COVID and the high interaction between students and community and promotoras. And we administered a survey. And one of the questions we asked is like, now that you've been part of Project Harvest and you've received your data and data visualizations for the past 3 years, right? We didn't, but we're like, you received your data visualizations. This was a question of like, now that I've been part of Project Harvest and received my data visualizations, I am better able to interpret COVID-19 data sets and images. And we had over 60% of participants strongly agree with that statement. We also are seeing that participants are reporting increases in environmental health awareness, and self-efficacy started out high in the project and continues to be high in the project, which is great to see. Specifically to garden roots, we've been able to see participants working together. So if we're now looking at, I was previously talking about this individual action, giving you some examples here of their interpreting the data, using it to inform their practice at home. If they needed to change their use of their harvested rainwater, they are. If they need to grow different crops from garden roots, they are. Even specifically at the community level and community change level for garden roots, we're able to see that people work together and are sharing the data. They actually, we discovered that a public water utility was issuing water that exceeded the drinking water standard for arsenic. That public water utility was issued a notice of violation and fined. We have a state agency focusing attention back on residential soils in the Superior area, and a community member in the Superior area has documented a company that was creating decorative rocks for the Phoenix area, was not controlling their fugitive dust emissions. He's like, Monica, what do I do? And I was like, you got these great pictures, send them to the state. Sent into the state representative went out and was like, you are correct that this is an exceedance, and issued that notice of violation. So that experience for that community member was massive, and they're recognizing their efficacy for community change and to protect environmental health. We're currently looking, so I started to talk about how Garden Roots has looked at collective action. Garden Roots has been going on for a lot longer than Project Harvest, so we are seeing collective action, but we are measuring collective action right now in Project Harvest. And so with the last 3 to 5 minutes of this presentation, I just wanted to summarize a major product, a research product of 2021, was this critical interpretive synthesis led by a former student, Leona Davis. And we asked the question, so I just gave you this whole presentation of like, environmental justice communities experience unique challenges. You have to ask the tough social and political questions of why there's unequal protection and distribution of waste. And then I say, strive for structural change. And what does that mean? Well, when you're trying to strive for structural change, use participatory approaches, because we know that we need to, that the partnership and transdisciplinary nature of this work can lead to structural change, or can do better, right? The more you engage in the cross-pollination of disciplines is the better. But then we were like, let's hone into what are the study design. And then I just went through, all the different steps of scientific research and how you can design programs to engage and co-design in an ethical way with community members. But then we were like, okay, let's look at what are the study design elements. So we did all this work and we're seeing some good stuff. But we're like, what has been done and shown in the field so far? So we asked the question of what are study design elements that prompt structural change to benefit environmental justice communities. And so again, we went through over 500 papers. We had our inclusion, exclusion criteria, all that goodie that you do with review papers. And when we narrowed it down, we got down to where we saw about 26% of projects led to structural change. And one of the things that we want to highlight is these 3 major areas. community members as leaders, opening the policy window, and long-term commitment. And here's one of the tables. I don't read this at all. So 26 of the 154 case studies that examined brought about structural change. Here you can see we did statistics to understand what the significance among projects that reported certain strategies versus others. And so going into that, right? So excuse me, it's 26. So just 26 out of the 154 we ended up focusing on brought about structural change. And so one of the things is all 26 started with local knowledge informing the research question. We also saw, right, that it was very important to have project management by a community-based organization or group. Community members are hired as paid staff. You work with community advisory boards that are not tokenistic, and you have culturally and community membership among your academic researchers. We saw that, 29% of the case studies we reviewed had at least one researcher as sharing community membership or key identity traits with the participant communities. So this is going with that number one, community members as leaders. The next one is opening the policy window. So in those 26 where we documented structural change, we see that over 80% collected data from more than one source. 50% collected both quantitative and qualitative data, right? So this was you had the environmental monitoring data in different environmental media combined with personal stories and oral histories. And 50% engaged in data translation for decision makers. And I'll also highlight here data translation and the recognition of multiple forms of knowledge, right, across different ethnic and minority groups. When looking at opening the policy window, 19 case studies successfully achieved a policy win. And these policy-related activities and goals were included in project planning. So case studies began by assessing the policy feasibility in tandem with environmental health risks, whereas others started with a specific policy objective. What am I trying to say here? Start your projects with a structural change goal in mind, right? Have a specific policy related or some type of structural change outlined in the beginning, informing all of the work. This is coming from one paper is recommending to start with a little p, like the little policy, looking at administrative rules, local enforcement, city budgets, right? Stuff at the, what we'd say maybe more of the policy at the school, county, or school district level, rather than going for the big policy at the state and federal legislation, meaning that in their work and some of the studies we saw here, if you started with a little p, you were able to achieve a policy goal. This might not be new news to anyone here, right? But long-term commitment. So we saw a moderate correlation between structural outcomes and projects that lasted more than 4 years. And so again, 42% reporting that more time was required than they initially anticipated. And ultimately, right, one of the things that a lot of people like to talk about is like, oh, they were part of this project and that's a benefit in itself. And hey, there's ample research showing the benefit to participants in participatory research for environmental health. We know how critical it is to increase understanding and literacy, as well as self-efficacy, someone's own sense of confidence or sense of control to address the environmental health risk. However, the benefit of that understanding or self-efficacy might not be able to outweigh that environmental justice community members' limited time and energy invested, nor provide a clear path to action, meaning that we know the burden that's experienced in justice spaces. And so just because you're able to increase knowledge and increase self-efficacy, that does not mean that the community member would be able to have a clear path to action because they might be limited by the amount of energy and time they have. So I'm going to end with these like recommendations for future work based on this research is leverage power and privilege, right? We need a diverse toolbox to address political, economic, and social structures that are creating the disproportionate environmental health burdens for communities of color and communities in poverty. You can't get around that. Along with technical and scientific knowledge, proximity to the power and prestige of a university may be an invaluable resource for academic allies to leverage on behalf of environmental justice communities. So what does this mean? Partner, partner, partner. Share the data. We also saw that structural change needs to be set as a measurable goal. This means that you're evaluating root cause of identified environmental health risks, you're analyzing power and policy structures surrounding the cause of that risk, you're identifying feasible structural change goals, and you're evaluating your community-driven approach to determine if it's benefiting the community. And lastly, I'll consider the positionality of the academic researcher. So I started off with my positionality statement, born and raised in this area, second generation Chicana. My dad was a miner in Arizona for a short amount of time in Arizona and Colorado, right? I bared witness to social environmental degradation. I am of color. So recognizing it's critical that research institutions formally value their potential role as cultural knowledge brokers with an understanding of both the community experience and the science to enhance the rigor and relevance of the participatory research. And this is a slide for my current PhD candidate that I decided to integrate here is the call to action, right? We have systems of oppression and systems of liberation. And so the results of this work, showing some of the data from Project Harvest and some of the data from Garden Roots, is that the results allow us to clarify anthropogenic, right? This is industrial and identify some root causes of contamination associated with capitalism and colonialization. And we need, not in all cases, right, do we need more research? We need more action to support liberation. And so this is a thumbs up to Kunal for preparing that slide. Just want to give a massive shout out to, this is the Project Harvest team. Here are the promotoras. Here's a suite of students. Not even all students are represented here as we've grown. But thank you to all the community research in which we've engaged and students who are working in the lab. And with that, I would say thank you and answer any questions.
All right, I'd like to thank you for that talk. Honestly, I couldn't imagine a better way to sort of finish up our seminar for the semester with a talk like that. In case you didn't know, this was our last talk for the semester for this seminar series, and that was just such a good way to end it. I actually want to steal the first question. I wanted to ask if you use your artwork in any sort of installations, like maybe in the public, with sort of like an environmental bent to kind of sort of bridge the gap to get people involved in science also.
So I think, so thank you for your kind words. In terms of the, so one of the things that has happened is with all of the visualizations, they have been used what we call as boundary objects. So people are using those in different ways, whether it's within the residential space, community space, and sharing it with others, or they're using it to create some type of change. In terms of actual installations, right? So I had a art student who, right, their goal is to get installations. And so they actually did their whole thesis, their whole Masters of Fine Art thesis on the impacts of mining. And that work was, it's been really difficult during COVID, but they shared their work in a museum space for others to come and visit, right, under limited number of people that could enter the gallery and so forth. They also have exhibited this work at Biosphere 2, which is the living biosphere, right, to look at the different biomes on Earth. And there are exhibit spaces there where it was exhibited, and we did capture people's perception to environmental contamination in that space. And ultimately, a lot of like our photographs are used. So I think in terms of being, we have another big thing is I've been giving talks in association with water exhibits and other forms of, I guess, like public materials, or either it's exhibits or books in public spaces. And so I would say that we have been working in that area, but we haven't been like generating specific material for to go up in a library. However, we do a lot of our engagement in those spaces.
Thank you very much. Other questions from the audience?
Hi, that was a really great talk. Thank you so much. You mentioned that you've been working with some of these communities for quite a long time now. I think 2006 was one of the older years that I saw posted. So I was wondering about if you had any significant community change within that time, I know some of the communities I work in West Baltimore, where you tend to have more renters than homeowners, and there can be a lot of movement in and out. So I was wondering how change within the community over time may have affected your work with the community. Like, do you have stable partnerships?
Yeah, so great question, and thank you for your kind words. So one of the things, like the partnership, like in working with the Sonoran Environmental Research Institute and working in the Southern Metropolitan Tucson area, we initially, that relationship started and we worked together on a pollution prevention program. And that's where myself, my colleague Denise Moreno Ramirez, and other researchers at the University of Arizona provided trainings to promotoras in English and Spanish, well, predominantly Spanish, on ways that businesses could be reducing their use of contaminants or reducing pollution, right? And mainly focusing on volatile organic compounds. And so then they got trained, and then they went out and did business visits. And we also did some business, Denise and I did some businesses with the promotoras as well. And one of the things that we were able to document was a significant reduction in the amount of volatile organic contaminants being reported by these businesses, these small businesses in the Southern metropolitan area. And so that was an important change to document. Another important change to document was that that climate change and sustainability adaptation promotora training that I brought up. We did a mixed methods approach to measuring any changes in knowledge and self-efficacy and people's sense of taking action to protect the environment and their health. And in both the promotoras pre and post surveying and interaction, as well as the pre and post interaction with the households that were trained by the promotoras, we saw a significant difference and an increase in reported self-efficacy and having an understanding and confidence that they could do something to lead to environmental protection and take action to protect the environment. So those are some great things. I brought up with Garden Roots, like the type of community change and people using the data, sharing it, identifying where there's exceedances of a Safe Drinking Water Act or Clean Air Act. But documenting overall, so those are just examples of, I think, like sustained community change. In terms of like populations moving in and out, I'm not able to answer that.
Thank you. Do we have other questions from the room, or perhaps someone online would like to ask a question? Other questions, especially folks online? Feel free, just chime in.
There might be a question in the chat.
Yeah.
There's a couple.
Yeah, no, I'm looking, I don't see any questions.
Yeah, we have a few minutes. There's probably one more question. If not, I'll go ahead and wrap up the seminar. That was a great presentation again. I just want to thank you so much because I was really engaged in that. And I think it was a great seminar to end our series. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It was an honor to present to your group today.